Right, and I think, thanks. I think another round of applause for Defa. He's done a good job. And straight on to Dr. Ndzendze. The floor is yours. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Program Director. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. All protocol observed. I know you are also representing a lot of different organizations that have put this conference together. I'm very honored to have been invited and to hear your address, Professor Otiso. I think it was a very insightful dissection of historical and contemporary and promising trends and patterns. And in the tradition of excellent keynotes, it cut across the various boundaries of our disciplines. And I know we come from a lot of different disciplines that we work on the day-to-day. And I think we were all left thinking that we can contribute, that we can take these questions that you have raised into our various domains, certainly in the area of political science, which I particularly work on. I think you gave us a deep look into the complex global level factors that determine city level linkages. You raised the role of geopolitics, diaspora, linkages, and general human movement. I saw that you are a political geographer, and terms like Cold War, soft power, diplomacy made me actually feel quite at home. I was a bit intimidated at first, but I think your delivery was so excellent and parsimonious that even novices such as myself can feel confident in what you've heard, and think that we can take these questions to our various areas of focus. So you raised the fact that there's a number of opportunities, both at the policy level as well as at the research level. There are these linkages, you showed the numbers, but what can be done with them? And I think my response, in a sense, is going to be 10 minutes or so of me agreeing with you on these questions, and maybe attempting to probe further and, in a sense, attempt to answer some of these questions myself. So the answer, I think, to any of these questions will be determined, as you rightly put, by the various vantage points that we are thinking from. Is it from a US standpoint? Is it from an African standpoint? And whose interests are we pursuing? You've looked at 6 or so areas or dimensions, 7, including diplomatic ties, socio-economic ties, political ties, military security ties. I must say I've done some work also on the security question, on the question of who benefits from AFRICOM. And the findings actually were quite surprising when I did a paper on this, I think about 5 years ago. The biggest winner, it seemed, is actually China, because it renders some of these climates safe. And because the Chinese are flush with cash more than the United States, they are able to take advantage of this investment-friendly climate. So it was quite an unexpected finding. Then you raised issues of knowledge and technology exchanges, networks between Africa and US cities, and then the role of old and new African diaspora, and of course, infrastructure, a point of much concern for South Africa and Johannesburg. You've also projected some future trends, multipolarity, very importantly, the keynotes, and of course, African integration, which is something that we all want to see. On the question of migration and the diaspora, as you were speaking, I thought actually these migratory patterns can be labs for policy making. You've shown the areas where Africans in the United States are concentrated. And I thought if I was a mayoral candidate, and I swear I am not seeking to be mayor, I think I would be out within a month. If I was seeking to be mayor, if I was a mayor, or just generally making policy in South Africa, I would actually go to places in the US where my diaspora is thriving, and study that place carefully and see what might be brought back home. Maybe Africans, I saw the high concentration in Texas, maybe what they really seek are low taxes, which I know Texas is famous for, school choice, charter schools, and maybe Africans also want a lot of steakhouses, who knows. From a political science standpoint, I'm then keen to dig up and see whether this work has actually been done. And I think if it hasn't, there is a huge opportunity, Dr. Wekesa, for us to actually collaborate on this. And the question of what role do centers such as this play in Africa Rising, in the Africa Rising narrative, and I underscored this, in helping the US to counter Chinese influence. I think the role is not that much. I think the game is over, so to speak. This is and I saw in the new US strategy that was announced by Antony Blinken, the city level for the first time is actually showing in US in the United States strategy for Africa, which had not been the case before. So I thought this is a good thing, but it tends to follow this, the overall thrust of the strategy tends to follow this anti-China kind of Cold War 2.0 focus, which I think, and not only think, but have actually demonstrated in a lot of my work to actually be misguided. Having worked closely actually with a Confucius Institute myself for some 3 years, I think ramping up cooperation with African countries only for the sake of countering somebody else is unsustainable. What if there was no China? Is the US in effect telling us that it wouldn't be seeking to work with Africa? Of course, realpolitik is what drives foreign policies, but it does raise concern. And if I'm an African policymaker or an African diplomat, I would say they are in it for themselves, and they are in it transactionally to counter China. What if China was not rising? Would the US disappear? It does raise some concern. Having also written and edited some 3 books with a focus on Africa and China relations, it is quite clear, at least in the post-Deng Xiaoping period, that China cooperated with the African continent not to counter anybody, but instead to grow its own economy. In other words, China was here and is here for its own gain, for its own material gain, and because its economy has come to depend on it. It is aggressively pursuing relations with the continent because its economy depends on it. It wants to secure access to resources on the short and long term. That is why it is so highly motivated, whereas the US seems to not be so highly motivated. It is here to play, in a sense, as you showed, a great game, a geopolitical game, but not what really matters for Africa, which is development. And so the Chinese influence on the African continent means what to Africans? It means hotels, it means factories, it means roads, it means infrastructure that has been built by China, not any sort of abstract geopolitical focus. So this kind of framing also, which is quite present in the US document, actually makes the US seem like it is a place that has run out of ideas, which is not the case, because in the current age that we are living in, the US has actually quite a lot to offer. It's ahead on things like artificial intelligence. It is ahead on things like the Internet of Things, which are very important for cities, because that is how you build a smart city. So the US actually needs to focus more on what it has to offer instead of attempting to counter or decampaign somebody else or other countries. So in my book, which has a very long title, unfortunately, I submitted something else to the publisher, but they came out with this one. So the book is called The Political Economy of Sino-South African Trade and Regional Competition. It's quite a mouthful. When I submitted it, I simply called it China and the Others, because the question in that book is, how has China in a century, 21st century, where there's a lot of growing economies and bigger economies, including Europe, the United States, and other rising countries in Asia, in the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, wherever you land on that discursive debate. So how did China come to actually surpass all these other countries, including Taiwan, by the way, which it only surpassed as far as South Africa is concerned in 2006. The question I wanted to ask there was, does every percentage of growth in goods traded between China and African countries mean that it is displacing another trade partner for the continent? And the answer is that no. There's been periods of mutual growth, but China has outpaced the other countries simply because it is making things that other countries are no longer making. And the US, in this regard, I think, can actually learn quite a lot by offering things that other countries cannot offer, and by actually pursuing a meaningful collaboration, not on a transactional basis or to try to counter somebody else. It does not sustain a relationship when it is approached this way. And many surveys are actually conducted by organizations such as the Afrobarometer and others. Quartz publishes this quite a lot. And we find here that many young Africans actually would still rather study in the US or relocate to the US than to China. And although this is changing, the US is still quite popular. And why is it changing? It's because of the unavoidable concerns about security. It's quite ironic that America, because of its constitution, which gives a lot of freedoms, including the right to keep and bear arms, has actually become a very hostile place, including in universities. We saw, I think, last week at Michigan State University, where there were some fatalities thanks to mass shootings, including, of course, the matter of Black lives, which are subject to police brutality. And so the US has a lot of work to do in terms of fixing itself and actually becoming and maintaining this edge that it has over other countries. And though it would seem here that actually the competition is not China, but Canada and Europe, countries that have a similar kind of curriculum, for example, as the US, a sort of liberal education, but which are safer because of gun laws and regulations. And so let me end off here. Professor Otiso raised the issue of geopolitics that shape city-to-city relations. And let me just add a rejoinder there and say politics is also domestic and local. And I think residents of Johannesburg would know this better than most, because we've had about 7 mayors in the space of 5 years. And there's coalitions and fragmentation. And so cities are university-based economies. The percentages vary, of course, but universities are usually among the biggest employers in any given city. They are places around which economies coalesce. Of course, this is a generalization. It may be different from city to city, but they're usually among the biggest employers. But at the same time, they are seen as instruments of foreign policy. And as we've seen, states have foreign policies, but also increasingly cities have foreign policies. And so it would seem to me that there is already, and there's going to be even more, of a battle for the soul of the university. We've seen, for example, in Florida, African studies is under siege because of the governor there deciding that this is not something that is important, and deciding that it does not align with his politics in essence. And so there's going to be a battle for the soul of the university. And I think it is important for us to look back to one of the more brilliant books on what does it mean to be an academy, a university. And it happens to be written by a graduate of my university, Professor Chris Brink. And he says here that it is important for universities to know both what they are good at, research, teaching and learning excellence, of course, but more importantly, what they are good for as institutions. And so I think as states and cities have foreign policies, I think universities must also have standing strategies for how to manage these politics. And in a sense, universities must have their own foreign policies so that whatever politics is at play, the direction of the universities, the role of the university does not change and become swayed by changing geopolitics, as well as national politics, as well as even city and local politics. So Professor Otiso, thank you very much for this thought-provoking keynote, and welcome to Johannesburg. I hope you have a pleasant stay.
Thank you, Dr. Ndzendze. I would like to invite both speakers to the podium so that we can entertain one or two questions. You'll agree with me that this has been a very interesting chat. I can see already hands up. I just wanted to have a quick comment on the basis of your discussions. We are discussing Africa-US cities, but Africa also has interests with cities in Europe, Asia, and so forth. And I think we've seen over the past couple of years, lots of mayors from China particularly, coming in very large delegations. And in fact, half the time they end up at State House, not the mayor's parlor. So I think it's a competitive thing. In one of my works, I noted that Africans, as usual, we are in the middle, like in the Cold War. We are being courted from everywhere, so we sometimes get thoroughly confused. You look this way and Biden is calling. You look this way, Xi Jinping is on your case. And so sometimes you're like, you keep checking which side is doing what. Having said that, let me start by a question there. Introduce yourself. Very brief, we are running out of time.
Yeah. My name is Leroy Wilson Jr. I live in Botswana. There are two things. One is a comment. Since Professor Otisa mentioned Ethiopian Airlines, I want you to know that Ethiopian Airlines was started by an African American named Lieutenant Colonel John Robinson. And if you go to Bole Airport in Addis Ababa, you'll see a plaque dedicated to him. The second thing is this. Dr. Listening to the comments that you made about the U.S.-Africa Summit, in July, the Corporate Council on Africa is sponsoring a U.S.-Africa Business Summit or Business Forum in Botswana. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
All right, second question, quickly.
Yeah, more of a comment, very thought-provoking discussion from the both of you. I don't know how to structure this one, but it's more around the geopolitical interests. South Africa is in a quagmire, if I might say, or put it that way, in this forever changing multipolar world. It finds itself, there's BRICS this side, which is getting more and more powerful, and there are other nations that are joining BRICS, but it also has ties with the US, which advises on matters of energy, telling South Africa to dump coal and go the renewable way, whereas in the West, we can see they're going back to coal stations. So those fundamental challenges, how do we then deal with them for cities, Africa, and in the US to start connecting? There needs to be that certainty in terms of policy direction, foreign policy direction in the country first. So what would be your comment on that?
Thank you. Any final one? That's the third and final one, and then we'll give the panelists the opportunity to respond in one fell swoop. Then we go for coffee. Yeah.
Thanks, Prof. And I'd just like to direct my question to the second speaker. And the reason being is because I'm interested in the book that he wrote, but more fundamentally, what are the lessons that African cities to Africa maybe they can learn or pick up from the foreign relations that they've had or where they have worked significantly? And I think the other one is when we talk about universities focusing on what they do best. How do you advise cities to focus on what they do best? In line with the book that you have actually done. When you look at City of Joburg, for example, I mean, when you look at our political system right now, when we're talking about coalition governments, which are not bringing viability and stability in terms of viable municipalities, for example, how do we create a system, or does it require political maturity? But how do we ensure that we protect infrastructure, maintain it, and ensure that our cities are also viable in the context of the relationships that they have with other countries and those that are actually funding them? And when we look at the China, I'm sorry now, I feel like, yeah, I'm wrapping up my question. When we look at the China-Africa relationships and the US as well, what are the impediments when we look at it in that context in terms of developing African cities? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Over to you, panelists. In 10 minutes, shared 5 minutes apiece.
Yeah.
Then we want to manage time a little more stridently this morning. Okay.
And I think mine would be very brief, actually. To the first question on the US-Africa Summit, I actually teach economic geography, so I've always been interested in that summit. And actually, it's a good thing. And for me, really, the key thing is what is in the table, what is being discussed. If I understand it correctly, it is a summit of American corporations that actually have businesses in Africa. But the important wrinkle to that summit is that now we have Africans who actually have businesses, who are American citizens, who are actually members of that particular group. So to me, the issue is, how do African countries work, even with a body like that is obviously interested in the African continent, to actually have a win-win situation out of that situation. So I actually have a positive view of it, especially if it can, like anything else, it's not bad in itself. It is, to me, a question of how the continent basically gets its act together to make sure that actually it engages effectively with those types of bodies. Unfortunately, there's a big African diaspora on the other side, both the older diaspora and the new diaspora, that actually can help to make sure that these engagements are mutually beneficial. So what I'll be looking for is, what has South Africa done to make sure that that relationship is beneficial? What has Kenya done? Are we just recipients, or are we actually engaging with that body of corporates that are already active in Africa to make sure that actually we benefit from the relationship? So I'm not one to demonize any particular group just because of it, but I like to look at what is in it and how can we engage with it and actually make sure that it's beneficial. So that would be my response. On the policy certainty, if you're an African country, you don't necessarily control US policy, and there's nothing you're going to do to make sure that there is policy certainty in the United States. I think, to me, the beginning point would have to be, is there policy certainty in South Africa? Is there policy certainty in Kenya? Because what we tend to see is these 5-year plans that keep switching. But if you look at American foreign policy, it's very resilient. Actually, it's very well known. It's democracy, trade, and a number of other things that, no matter whether it's a Democrat or a Republican that is in power, there's always certain elements of US policy that are enduring. That is what I would ask us to start thinking about. Start being long-term thinkers, not short-term thinkers. And once we have our act together, then we actually are in a position now to start making claims on other people. Some of the comments that President Trump made about African countries, he will not make easily to European countries, even though some of them don't necessarily behave any better. You know, he wouldn't make them, let's say, to a number of other countries. So which tells you that somebody in their curricula thinks that they can make disparaging remarks about African countries and get away with it. That is not necessarily America's fault. Some of that is us. The 67, we're closing on 60 years of independence, most of these countries. For the first decade, it used to be easy to point fingers at everyone else. Increasingly, when I point one finger this way, there are 3 fingers that are pointing inward. So this is the finger pointing at the US. We can always blame colonialism all we want. India was also colonized. China was also colonized, but they have learned the rules of the game. Capitalism is a game. You learn it well, you start playing by its rules, you're gonna even win and beat some of the older, originators of the game. So in short, let's get organized. We should be able to do better. But suddenly the excuses are becoming fewer and fewer, especially the more effective ones.
Thank you very much for for those questions. I'll answer as many as I can, also mindful of time. First, on the question of BRICS and South Africa seeming to look towards BRICS, but also there are these US policy positions that are seemingly being pushed onto South Africa. I have strong views about both, actually, and my views are published on this. I actually find no value as it stands for South Africa being in the BRICS. I've run the numbers, like you, Prof. I try to lean on the empirical data. When you look at the trade, particularly between South Africa and all 4 BRICS countries, the other BRIC countries, what you find is a lot of growth in trade with China. But the momentum of that trade was already on the up in terms of the trajectory long before South Africa joined the BRICS. If you will recall, the original conception of the BRICS was that it is a set of countries that are going to be challenging Western imperialism and US unilateralism and bullying and so on. But the BRICS is an impermanent organization. Ideologically speaking, it is as progressive as the leaders who are sitting there are progressive themselves. But of course, we saw Bolsonaro, who is a right-wing sort of politician. We've seen Narendra Modi, who is a right-leaning politician. And I doubt also Putin himself would consider himself to be a progressive kind of leftist figure. And so what has happened over time is that South Africa has found itself in a grouping that it is ideologically out of sync with. Also in South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa's policy, I would say, is not in the tradition of leftist internationalism, so that it is not particularly well placed in the BRICS. So the BRICS is a shifting entity. Every now and again, there's elections. You don't know what kind of that photo op. I mean, the only figure who's been there in all of them, of course, is Xi Jinping, or in most of them anyway. You have this rotating musical chairs, which is a good thing. It's democracy. But I would say limit your hopes when it comes to BRICS and what it can achieve. I also looked at investment flows between these countries and South Africa. The stock markets of these countries are actually nowhere near as integrated as they should be. And why do I look at stock markets? Because it is a measure of how much the relationship has taken on a life of its own, particularly investor sentiment. Do Brazilians, do Russians, do Chinese, do Indians look at South Africa as an investment-friendly market? And the answer is they do not. The investment flows have actually been quite dry, and in many instances, South African investors have been taking their money to these other countries. Proportionally, South African investors invest more in these other BRICS countries than they do in South Africa, for a whole host of reasons. Technology, innovation being among these reasons. But I would also say there is a lot to learn from the various BRICS countries in terms of digitalization. For example, Moscow is one of the most digitalized cities in the world. Shenzhen in China, which has the GDP, imagine a city, it has a GDP the size of South Africa. And so there's quite a lot to learn there. And all of that growth is based on technology. It is called the China's Silicon Valley. So that is my view on the BRICS.
Thank you very much.
They're quite moderate. And then on the question of cities and what they are good for, it's a question that I think would be best given to a colleague in my department, actually, who works on this question quite a lot in terms of city-to-city diplomacy. But I would say know what you're good at. The principle of the comparative advantage. And let me just say also on the US, just so I'm not accused of being biased. I also do not agree with the US trying to determine the pace of South Africa's transition to green energy. and Texas came up. And of course, Texas was frozen over in 2021, in early 2021, because of the US's own poorly planned energy policy. So the US or any other country is in no position to lecture to South Africa what direction its energy policy should take. And I would also blame South Africans for being complacent on this. South Africans know one language when it comes to expressing their dissatisfaction. That is, of course, protest. Where is the protest for a more secure and more realistic energy policy?
I think you can wrap up, colleague.
Sorry? Okay, let me wrap up. So on the question of cities, I was going to touch on the points of a comparative advantage. Johannesburg is not Cape Town, and Cape Town is not Durban. I don't think Johannesburg, maybe I'm wrong, I haven't looked at the figures, but I wouldn't imagine people come as tourists for its own sake to Johannesburg. It is a commercial town, a city, a metro, and I would say mainstream your education, for example, to grow what your city is good at. And for us, I think that is financial services. That is one of the areas. And of course, education. Johannesburg, Wits, just between themselves, have close to 100,000 students, and many of them international. So I would say work with your various sectors and do not buy for 1 billion rand a space on the T-shirt of Tottenham Hotspurs. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Very enriching presentations and discussions there. As I mentioned, we are recording these, we'll transcribe and we'll share those as reports. And apologies, colleagues, for being on your neck. I know, Bhaso, you'll be chairing a session soon where I'll be speaking, and you'll be on my case like I've been on yours today. I hope you'll be polite, though. But for now, I think let's break very quickly for coffee, tea, 6 minutes, colleagues, so that we are here at 10:30 for a session that was supposed to have started at 10 minutes past. And colleagues who are joining us online, kindly just bear with us. You can also grab your digital coffee and enjoy it as we do that. But let's do that so that we save time and yeah. And thanks, yeah.